On November 5th, France decided to send armored vehicles to the Lebanese army, despite concerns of the West and Israel that they could fall into the hands of Hezbollah and Iran. Paris also supplies arms to Armenia, which actively helps Russia to evade Western sanctions. As well, Armenia is also a military and logistical pillar of the Russian-Iranian alliance. Why do France's arms supply to Armenia and Lebanon pose a threat to the West? And how does Macron's policy conflict with US and EU interests in the Middle East and the South Caucasus? AZfront gives an explanation. On November 11th, French President Macron advocated a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip and blatantly called on Israel to stop bombing babies, women, and the elderly. This position of Paris contradicts the standpoints of such countries as the US, Britain, and Germany, which believe that a ceasefire will only help Hamas to strengthen. Thus, US President stated that, to Hamas's members, every ceasefire is time they exploit to rebuild their stockpile of rockets, reposition fighters, and restart the killing by attacking innocents again. Britain's defense minister also opposed the ceasefire. If Britain had been subjected to an attack of terrorists, and we knew where these terrorists had gone, no one would be saying to Britain, stop going after them. Contradictions in France's positions have also arisen over the issue of arms supplies to Lebanon. On November 5th, the head of the French Defense Ministry announced the transfer of armored vehicles to the Lebanese army to strengthen it. And this happens against the backdrop of growing tensions between Israel and the Iranian-controlled Lebanese political and military organization Hezbollah. In response, the National Interest magazine, the mouthpiece of moderate U.S. Republicans, in an article dated November 16th, criticized Paris, noting that any military equipment supplied to the Lebanese army will make its way to the terrorist group Hezbollah or Iran. Even before the current escalation of the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Israelis had been urging the West not to supply arms to Lebanon, reporting that Hezbollah's arsenal includes weapons transferred to Lebanon by the US, France, and Britain. Despite all this, Paris announced the transfer of several dozen advanced armored vehicles, VAB, to Beirut. The next day, after the Hezbollah leader announced the participation of his fighters in unprecedented fighting along the Lebanon-Israel border. On October 23rd, the heads of the defense ministries of Armenia and France signed documents on bilateral cooperation, and almost 3 weeks later, France delivered the first batch of expected armored personnel carriers to Armenia. The equipment was delivered to Armenia via Georgia, which for a long time refused to carry out this transit. According to French newspaper Le Monde, the cooperation between Paris and Yerevan will include supplying Armenia with short-range Mistral missiles, 3 GM-200 radars designed to detect air threats up to 250 kilometers away, and sending French soldiers to Armenia by the beginning of the year 2024 to train the country's armed forces. Macron's policy is contrary to that of the US and the EU in the South Caucasus as well. While the EU is trying to play the role of a mediator in the issue of achieving peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan, France is supplying arms to one of the parties, Armenia. By such actions, France undermines the efforts of the US and United Europe to achieve peace in the South Caucasus. On November 20th, Azerbaijani President Aliyev said, France is playing a very destructive role in the South Caucasus. Actually, Armenia became a puppet of the French government now, and this can be a serious threat to the regional stability. Arms supplies to Armenia are a cause for concern of Ukraine and Israel. Ukrainian and European media have repeatedly warned that Armenia, whose authorities publicly recognize the military strategic partnership with Iran, is a military and logistical pillar of the Russian-Iranian alliance and actively helps Russia to evade Western sanctions. The Ukrainian news agency Union wrote about it on May 9th, as well as the largest Romanian news resource, DG. Drones, with the help of which Russia is attacking Ukraine's infrastructure, have been transported from Iran to Russia through the territory of Armenia. It is noteworthy that immediately after the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, in the first half of 2022, the bilateral trade turnover between Yerevan and Moscow increased by 42%. The growth in trade turnover continued the following year, with an 86% increase in the same period of 2023. On May 14th, the Washington Post called on the West to turn up the heat on Armenia from which the re-export to Russia of a range of critical goods, including electronics, has spiked. The largest U.S. Jewish weekly newspaper, the Jewish Press, also wrote that French supplies to Armenia could fall into the hands of the biggest enemies of Ukraine and Israel, Russia and Iran. These fears were confirmed by Canadian analyst Robert Cutler, who works for a number of NATO-affiliated Western think tanks. French air defense system going to Russia through Armenia to be reverse-engineered in cooperation with Iran, to be redeployed against Ukraine and Israel. Despite all the warnings, France has not refused to supply Armenia with arms, thus becoming one of Yerevan's 3 military political patrons, together with Russia and Iran. The weapons that France transferred to Lebanon and Armenia could be used by Russia and Iran against the West's allies, Ukraine and Israel. This is a threat to the Western countries themselves. While they pursue a coordinated policy in the Middle East and the South Caucasus, Macron's policy in these regions conflicts with the common interests of the US and EU countries. The Caucasus and Middle East is closer to Europe and US than it seems at first glance. Subscribe and click on the bell in order to be informed of the main events. See you soon.